Adrian Falero.
My question is for Arthur Sinodinos, as the former president of the New South Wales Liberal Party. The democratic reform that saw Bill Shorten elected as Labor leader this weekend highlights a stark contrast to the New South Wales Liberal Party, who made news last week for suspending a party member who dared to speak in favour of internal democratic reform. As both Tony Abbott, John Howard, and many other MPs and former MPs are on the record supporting democratic reform in the New South Wales Liberal Party, are these suspensions an abuse of factional powers in New South Wales and an attempt to stifle debate? Or are you not allowed to comment on this matter for fear of expulsion yourself?
I don't think that will explain.
Well, look, I don't think I'm in imminent fear of expulsion, and I can comment on the topic. And you're right, Adrian, I was a former president of the Liberal Party in New South Wales. I think what happened in the Liberal Party recently is actually bringing to a head issues that have been going on within the party for a while in New South Wales. A number of the other divisions of the Liberal Party have adopted more grassroots-based pre-selection processes. I'm thinking of places like Queensland and Victoria. And there is a push in New South Wales to do the same thing. And the party president, Chris Downey, is pushing a process to do that, a reform process, of which at one stage I was going to be a part. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means two things. The first is that going to a more open plebiscite system in due course. As you mentioned, there are a number of senior Liberals like John Howard and others who are in favour of that. But we want to do it in a considered way. In Victoria, it took 2 or 3 years of consultation with the membership, with about 10 or 11,000 members, to get a form of plebiscite and pre-selection which was acceptable to the membership as a whole. That will happen in New South Wales in due course. As part of that, what also needs to happen is that we must also make sure that individual branches accept members, that we don't get to a situation where members in a branch can just pick and choose who is part of it. So you don't create factional fiefdoms, so you create a greater openness at the grassroots. Now, the New South Wales system hasn't been a bad system. It's tried to sort of balance control from the centre with control from the grassroots. But it's moving more now in a decentralised way. It will take time, but it will get there. It's unfortunate that there have been some of the incidents you mentioned lately. I'm not going to comment on them specifically, but there is a reform process underway. Can I just jump in
just on that subject? Was it wrong for the party to threaten to expel a reformer who dared to speak out, John Ruddick?
John's status is that he'll be talking to the state executive in a month, so he hasn't actually been expelled yet. But what's been happening over a long period of time is that there have been ructions in the New South Wales division. This has brought it to a head. Actually, in a way, it's good that it's out in the open so that it gets done properly. The other thing that Tony Abbott has done by mentioning or sort of at the first ministry meeting that he wanted to move on lobbyists, we now have a situation where you can either be on the executive or you can be a lobbyist, but you can't be both.
Well, except if you're that party president, Chris Downey, that you talked about, because he is a lobbyist. He's an in-house lobbyist and he's kept his position because he's an in-house lobbyist.
Where Tony has gone is that you have to be a registered lobbyist. He's a member of an industry association.
Yes, the Australian Wagering Council, which is, of course, the lobby group for the gaming industry.
I think you'll find that Chris Downey will be one of the people in the vanguard of further reform in New South Wales.
Lally Katz.
Well, to be honest, I don't know many of the specifics or terminology of this, but I guess something that I often wonder about, like with either of the parties, is how you handle when people have all kinds of different opinions and then suddenly everyone sort of has to have the same opinion. And that always kind of boggles my mind, because I find it sort of hard to believe when people are speaking that that's actually what they believe, probably because sometimes it's not. But I don't know if that's off the subject.
Well, no. In this case, if he had a different opinion, he's been threatened with 5 years suspension. And I go back to the question I asked you earlier. Was that wrong?
What, to threaten him with?
Yeah.
I think it was right to ask John to explain certain things which had happened in the past. But the point is that this process will now bring to a head those reform issues that we're talking about. So in that sense, it's good that we can go forward from here.
Let's go to the rest of the panel and hear from Jeff McMullen.
Lally is exactly right. It's a mockery of democracy to gag someone who goes on the national broadcaster to try to discuss reforming party behaviour. I mean, that is the problem in both political parties, that you ask your members to keep their opinions to themselves, so you don't really get conscience until you have a conscience vote. You don't really get principle because it stays in the back room. So until you have the gumption to allow your individual party members and your members of parliament to stand up and say what they really think, then we, the people in this democracy, will go on thinking it's a club. It is not democracy.
Can I just directly answer that, Jeff? Because when I join a political party, the contract I enter into is that I'm joining a particular brand, because in general I subscribe to the values and beliefs of that particular brand, if I can put it like that. These are movements. For me, and I don't want to speak for Penny, but these are vocations. But you realise when you're part of a team, it's like when you're playing a sport. You do things as part of the team. And I'm not saying you do things against your conscience. If it gets to that point, I'd rather go. But my point is, when you're a member of a team, you have to accept there are rules in being in the team, and that you're not always going to win on all issues, and sometimes you've just got to accept the majority verdict and move on, because that will help you to achieve the greater good that you're seeking by subscribing to the values and beliefs of that particular group.
Let's hear from Warren Mundine.
I think it sounds like a zombie apocalypse now. You know, everyone's got to think the same, everyone's got to be the same, everyone's got to operate the same. Now, look, to me, you know, I thought it was quite bizarre. One thing that, after I do agree with you, did bring it to a head. No one would have heard of John Ruddick. No one would have heard of any of this reform stuff until the 5-year ban ridiculously come out and threatened him. So I'm actually glad that did happen, because now you're going to have a democratic process hopefully put in place and things are going to happen. But I think it is a bizarre situation that a person joins a political party in a Westminster democratic system and then is threatened with banning for 5 years for actually saying what he thinks.
Now, you didn't support the democratic vote for the Labor leadership, the former Labor president. I know you're no longer a member of the party, but did you change your mind watching the process?
What in regard? Look, yeah. I found it. There's one thing I did notice about it. I do agree that I wasn't supportive, and I'm still not actually supportive of that process about the parliamentary leader. I think that the parliamentary team needs to pick the leader. I think there needs to be more democracy in regard to pre-selection processes. There's no doubt about that, because I think that's where the real issues are. But one thing that I do agree with, that it did sort of energise the membership, and that's one thing I found quite exciting about it.
Penny Wong, well, you can reflect on the original question and move on to your own situation.
I'm going to first apologise for my voice.
Yes.
To your viewers and to everybody. I thought I'd sound interestingly husky by tonight. Now I sound like a Star Wars character, so I apologise for that. Well, it's an interest. I think a 5-year suspension threat is a pretty extraordinary way to deal with dissent. And I get what Martha's saying. I mean, I do think when people vote for a party, they don't vote for Penny Wong, they vote for Penny Wong, Labor candidate. And so, you know, there are certain team requirements that come with that. But I thought that was a pretty odd way of dealing with different views inside the party. We obviously have just gone through a really important and, as Warren says, energising process. And I think it's been great. And it's about trying to open up the party and giving members a greater engagement with the Labor Party. We had 2 great men campaigning, talking about ideas, engaging with members, and I think it's been a really fantastic process for Labor, and one I very strongly support.
Arthur, I'll just come back to you finally on the point. You've watched the Labor Party go through this process. Is there any attraction for the Liberal Party to consider doing the same sort of thing? To actually really opening up the party to democracy?
I think the party is open to democracy. But the point I make about the leadership is, and I agree here with Warren, the best people often to judge the capacities of the leader are the people who directly work with them, who are themselves politicians and know who might attract or not attract support from the public as a whole, as opposed to from the membership of the party. And often there can be a divergence between where the membership of a party stand and the community as a whole. That's been the principle in the Liberal Party. And the other principle has been the organisation raises the money, pre-selects the candidates, and the parliamentary party determines policy and the leader.
And final quick
by the way, if we had a membership-based election at the moment of leader, Tony Abbott would win hands down. Hands down. I don't think that would change any sort of result.
A final quick question, because Tony Abbott, in fact, described this John Riddick as a sort of George Washington character for his honesty and his integrity. That's some years ago. Do you think the party should pull back from this threat to expel him?
John will have the opportunity at the next state executive meeting to discuss all this and I think watch this space.
So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, in other words?
Yes, there is. In other words...
In other words, yes, there is. In other words, what?
Well, in your